It was a quiet morning at the regional airport, the kind of day where everything seemed to move a little slower. The sun peeked through the clouds, casting a warm golden glow over the tarmac. Travelers bustled in and out of the terminal, their chatter blending with a hum of engines in the distance. But for one man, this seemingly ordinary day was about to become anything but typical. Captain Elijah Cole, a respected airline pilot with years of experience under his belt, had just landed his private aircraft. Dressed sharply in his uniform, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating the skies. Yet, despite his polished demeanor, there was one detail about Elijah that often drew attention: his skin color. In an industry still grappling with representation and diversity, Elijah was one of the few black pilots, a fact he wore with pride. As Elijah exited the hangar, the smooth concrete beneath his polished shoes reflected his steady stride. He glanced around the airport grounds, taking in the familiar sights and sounds. It wasn't just another day for him. It was a day to check in on the property he had recently invested in. Elijah wasn't just a pilot. He was the proud owner of this very hangar, part of a dream he had worked tirelessly to achieve. But as Elijah approached the gate that separated the hangar from the main airport grounds, a different scene began to unfold. A security guard, tall and imposing, stepped into view. His eyes narrowed as he caught sight of Elijah. Something in his expression shifted, a mix of suspicion and authority, like someone preparing for a confrontation. "Excuse me," the guard called out, his tone sharp and demanding. Elijah paused, slightly taken aback by the abruptness. "Yes," Elijah responded calmly, maintaining his composure. "Can I help you?" "This is a restricted area," the guard said, his gaze unwavering. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "I have business here. Is there a problem?" The guard crossed his arms, his stance firm. "Do you have any identification? This area is for authorized personnel only." Elijah reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his ID and pilot credentials. He handed them over without hesitation, hoping it would diffuse the tension. But instead of reviewing them carefully, the guard barely glanced at the documents before looking back up at Elijah with skepticism. "I'm going to need you to wait right here," the guard said, his voice tinged with doubt. Elijah's brow furrowed. "Wait for what? I've already provided my ID. Is there an issue?" But the guard didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his radio, speaking in a hushed tone as if he were reporting a breach. Elijah's heart sank. He had experienced moments like this before, moments where assumptions were made about him before he could even explain himself. But this time felt different. This was his property, his achievement, his dream. Minutes felt like hours as Elijah stood there, his patience wearing thin. Around him, the airport's usual buzz continued, oblivious to the silent storm brewing by the gate. The guard's behavior wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a painful reminder of the prejudice Elijah had fought to overcome throughout. Minutes felt like hours as Elijah stood there, his patience wearing thin. Around him, the airport's his life. Then came the turning point. A police car pulled up, lights flashing, and two officers stepped out. They approached with caution, their hands resting near their belts. Elijah's heart raced. What should have been a routine day had spiraled into something surreal. As the officers began to question him, Elijah calmly explained who he was, what he was doing there, and most importantly, why he belonged. The disbelief on the faces of those around him was palpable, but Elijah wasn't done yet. He had one more piece of information that would change everything. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not just a pilot using this hangar. I own it." The words hung in the air, met with stunned silence. Even a security guard, who had been so confident in his assumptions, faltered. For the first time, the weight of his actions seemed to sink in. But what would happen next was a lesson no one on that tarmac would soon forget. The words "I own it" seemed to echo in the air, leaving the group in a collective moment of shock. The officers exchanged glances, their initial skepticism flickering into something closer to confusion. The security guard, whose confidence had been unshaken moments earlier, now looked visibly unsettled. His arms, once tightly crossed, dropped to his sides as if the weight of the revelation had knocked him off balance. But Elijah wasn't surprised. He had seen this kind of reaction before, people struggling to reconcile their assumptions with the truth. One of the officers finally broke the silence. "You're saying you own this hangar?" His tone was less accusatory now, more curious, as if he was trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't fit his expectations. "Yes," Elijah replied, his voice calm but unwavering. "I purchased it earlier this year. I've been working closely with airport management to expand operations here. You can verify this with them if you'd like." He pulled out his phone, ready to make the call himself if it came to that. The guard stiffened, his face turning a shade of red that hinted at a mix of embarrassment and frustration. "If that's true," he said, trying to regain some semblance of authority, "why didn't you say something earlier?" Elijah let out a short, humorless laugh, his composure unbroken. "I did, but it seems you weren't interested in hearing it." For a moment, nobody spoke. The bustling airport around them carried on as usual, but in that small bubble by the gate, time felt frozen. Elijah could see the gears turning in the guard's head, the slow realization that his actions had been based on nothing more than an assumption. It wasn't the first time Elijah had been in this position, but it didn't make it any easier. Elijah took a deep breath, thinking back to the journey that had led him to this moment. Elijah crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "You didn't ask," he said simply. Becoming a pilot had always been his dream, but it hadn't been an easy path. Growing up in a small town, he was one of the few kids who spent more time looking up at the sky than playing on the ground. While other kids chased after footballs or bikes, Elijah chased after the roar of planes flying overhead. To him, those planes weren't just machines. They were freedom, adventure, and opportunity all wrapped into one. But dreaming big wasn't always encouraged in his community. People told him to be realistic, to focus on careers that seemed more attainable. And when he expressed his dream of becoming a pilot, the skepticism was almost palpable. "There aren't many black pilots," one teacher had said, not unkindly, but with a tone that carried the weight of doubt. "You know how hard that is to achieve." Elijah knew, but he didn't let that stop him. He worked harder than anyone else, pouring himself into his studies, saving every dollar he could, and eventually earning a scholarship to flight school. Even there, he had to prove himself over and over again, not just as a pilot, but as a person deserving of a seat in the cockpit. It wasn't enough to be good. He had to be exceptional to silence the doubters. Years later, Elijah had more than earned his wings. He flew commercial jets, logged thousands of hours in the air, and gained the respect of his peers. But even as a successful pilot, he wasn't immune to moments like this. Moments where he had to fight not just for respect, but for recognition of his right to belong. Buying the hangar was a way to plant his flag, to create a space where he didn't have to justify himself to anyone. Yet here he was, doing just that. The officers stepped aside to radio the airport's main office, leaving Elijah and the security guard standing in an awkward silence. The guard shuffled his feet, glancing around as if hoping for an escape from the tension. Elijah, however, stayed rooted in place, his gaze steady. "You know," Elijah said after a long pause, "you could have handled this differently." The guard looked up, his expression defensive. "I was just doing my job. There are protocols." "Protocols," Elijah interrupted, his tone sharper now, "don't include treating someone like a criminal before you know the facts." The guard opened his mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. He looked away, his jaw tightening. Elijah didn't press further. He wasn't interested in an argument. He wanted this situation resolved so that he could get back to what he had planned for the day. But part of him couldn't shake the frustration bubbling under the surface. He had worked too hard to still be facing these kinds of barriers. The officers returned a moment later, their radios crackling with confirmation. "We spoke to the airport manager," one of them said. "It checks out. He's the owner." The guard's face fell, his shoulders slumping as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I didn't know, he stammered, his earlier bravado completely gone. Elijah crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. You didn't ask, he said simply. The officers glanced between the two men, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Well, one of clearing his throat, it looks like everything is in order here. Sorry for the misunderstanding, Captain Cole. Elijah nodded, appreciating the formal acknowledgement but still feeling the sting of the encounter. I'd appreciate it if these kinds of misunderstandings didn't happen again, he said. His tone wasn't angry, but it carried the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime dealing with situations like this. The officers nodded before heading back to their car, leaving Elijah and the security guard alone again. The guard hesitated, looking like he wanted to say something, but Elijah had already turned away. He walked toward the hangar, his back straight, his head held high. He wasn't going to let this moment define his day or his journey. Inside the hangar, the familiar smell of aviation fuel and the sight of his plane brought him a sense of calm. This was his space, his accomplishment, and no one could take that away from him. But as he began inspecting his aircraft, a lingering thought stayed with him. This wasn't just about one guard or one misunderstanding. It was about a larger issue, one that he couldn't ignore. Elijah made a mental note to bring this up with the airport management. It wasn't about holding a grudge. It was about ensuring that no one else had to go through what he just experienced. Change didn't happen overnight, but it started with conversations, with awareness, and with people like him refusing to stay silent. As he ran his hands over the sleek surface of the plane, a small smile crept onto his face. This was his dream, his hard-earned reality, and no amount of ignorance or prejudice could take that away. He was determined to keep flying higher, no matter what tried to bring him down. As Elijah inspected his plane, the weight of the encounter at the gate lingered, heavier than he wanted to admit. It wasn't just about the inconvenience or the indignity of being questioned about his right to be there. It was the nagging realization that no matter how far he'd come, how much he'd accomplished, there would always be someone who doubted him, someone who saw only what they expected to see. He tightened a loose screw on the wing panel, his movements deliberate, as if fixing the plane could help him straighten out his thoughts. The hum of activity outside the hangar seemed distant now, drowned out by his own swirling reflections. He thought about the security guard, about the look on his face when he realized Elijah was the owner. It wasn't just embarrassment. There was something else, something Elijah recognized all too well: shame. But was that enough? Did a fleeting moment of regret undo the assumptions that led to the incident in the first place? Elijah wasn't sure. His phone buzzed on the workbench, pulling him out of his thoughts. The screen lit up with a familiar name: Chris Patterson, his longtime friend and business partner. Chris had been instrumental in helping Elijah secure the hangar, acting as a sounding board and an occasional reality check during the long and often frustrating process. "Hey, Chris," Elijah said, answering the call. His voice was calm, but there was a tightness in his tone that Chris picked up on immediately. "Everything okay?" Chris asked. "You sound off." Elijah sighed, leaning against the plane's fuselage. "Had a bit of a run-in with security. They didn't think I belonged here." Chris groaned on the other end. "You're kidding. After everything we went through to get that place?" "Nope. Apparently, owning the hangar and being a black man in a pilot's uniform doesn't compute for some people." Chris was quiet for a moment, and Elijah could practically hear him choosing his words carefully. "Look, I know it's not the first time you've dealt with this, but it doesn't make it any less messed up. Did you report it?" "I will," Elijah said, "but right now, I'm just trying to cool off." Chris hesitated. This could be bigger than just you. If it's happening to you, it's probably happening to others. Maybe this is an opportunity to shine a light on it." Elijah considered this, his fingers tracing the smooth metal of the plane's body. Chris was right, of course, but the idea of turning this into a public battle felt exhausting. He was used to being the one to fight, to educate, to prove himself. Sometimes he just wanted to fly his planes and enjoy the fruits of his labor without having to confront the world's biases at every turn. "I'll think about it," Elijah said finally, but he wasn't sure if he meant it. He thanked Chris for calling and ended the conversation, his mind still buzzing. As the day wore on, Elijah couldn't shake the thought that this incident wasn't isolated. It was a symptom of a larger issue, one he'd encountered in various forms throughout his life. He remembered the subtle doubts from his instructors in flight school, the passengers who looked surprised, or even uneasy, when they realized their pilot was a black man, the colleagues who assumed he was part of the ground crew before he put on his captain's hat. It was a pattern, and patterns didn't break unless someone disrupted them. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Elijah sat in the small office attached to the hangar. The room was modest but functional, with a desk, a few chairs, and a bulletin board cluttered with flight schedules and notes. He stared at his laptop, scrolling through news articles and social media posts about similar incidents. There were stories of professionals in other fields, doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, who had faced the same skepticism, the same baseless assumptions. One story in particular caught his eye. It was about a young woman, a surgeon, who had been detained at a hospital because someone didn't believe she was a doctor. Her account was raw and emotional, but it ended with a powerful message about resilience and the importance of speaking out. Elijah felt a flicker of inspiration, but also a twinge of guilt. He admired her courage, but he wasn't sure he had the energy to do the same. The next morning, Elijah arrived at the airport early, determined to meet with the airport manager. He wasn't looking for an apology, though it wouldn't hurt, but he wanted to make sure steps were taken to prevent this from happening again. As he walked toward the administration office, he passed the security guard from the previous day. Their eyes met briefly, and the guard looked away, his discomfort obvious. Elijah kept walking, his stride steady. In the meeting, the manager listened attentively as Elijah recounted the incident. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Karen Holt, who had been overseeing the airport for over a decade. Karen took notes, her expression growing more serious as Elijah spoke. "I'm sorry this happened," she said when he finished. "It's unacceptable, and I'll make sure it's addressed. We have training programs in place, but clearly we need to do more." Elijah appreciated her sincerity, but he wasn't entirely convinced. "It's not just about training," he said. "It's about changing the mindset. People need to stop jumping to conclusions based on appearances." Karen nodded. "You're absolutely right. And I'd like your input on how we can improve. Maybe we can collaborate on something, an initiative to promote inclusivity and awareness, especially in industries like ours where representation still lags behind." Elijah was caught off guard. He hadn't expected her to involve him in the solution. Part of him wanted to decline, to leave the responsibility with the airport. But another part of him, the part that had always believed in creating opportunities for others, felt a spark of possibility. "I'll think about it," he said, echoing the words he'd told Chris. But this time he meant it. As he left the office, the sun breaking through the morning clouds, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The tension from the previous day was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was joined by something else, an idea, a vision of what could be. He wasn't just flying planes or managing a hangar. He was navigating a journey that could help others soar too. The days that followed were anything but quiet. Word of the incident spread across the airport, first as murmurs among staff, and then as a full-blown topic of discussion among employees, pilots, and even regular visitors. Elijah hadn't intended to make it public, but his conversation with Karen Holt had sparked internal discussions, and people were beginning to take notice. It wasn't long before he started receiving curious glances and whispered questions from strangers. The security guard, whose name Elijah learned was Paul, seemed to avoid him at all costs. Whenever their paths crossed, Paul would divert his gaze or busy himself with something else. Elijah wasn't sure if it was guilt or stubbornness, but either way, it left an air of unresolved tension between them. Elijah found himself wondering if Paul had learned anything from the experience or if he'd simply retreated into his own discomfort. Meanwhile, Karen had wasted no time in moving forward with her plan for an inclusivity. She called Elijah a few days later, asking if he'd be willing to share his story as part of a training program for airport staff. At first, Elijah hesitated. It wasn't that he was unwilling to speak up. It was more about the weight of doing so. Sharing his story meant reliving moments he often tried to put behind him, and it meant putting himself in the spotlight in a way he wasn't entirely comfortable with. But as Karen talked about the importance of setting an example, Elijah thought about the young pilots who might walk through those gates someday. He thought about the kids who looked up at the sky and dreamed of flying but might hesitate because they didn't see anyone who looked like them in the cockpit. He couldn't ignore the bigger picture. So, with some reluctance, he agreed. The day of the training session arrived faster than Elijah expected. He stood in the conference room, dressed in his pilot's uniform, his hands resting lightly on the podium in front of him. The room was filled with airport staff, including Paul, who sat near the back with his arms crossed and a guarded expression on his face. Karen introduced Elijah, her tone warm and encouraging, before stepping aside to let him speak. Elijah took a deep breath, scanning the faces in the room. Some looked curious, others skeptical, but most seemed open and attentive. He began by sharing his journey, from the little boy who dreamed of flying to the seasoned pilot who had worked tirelessly to break barriers in the industry. He talked about the challenges he faced, not just in becoming a pilot, but in being recognized and respected as one. As he recounted the incident with Paul, he chose his words carefully. He wasn't there to shame anyone or point fingers. Instead, he framed it as a learning moment, a chance to reflect on the assumptions people make and the impact those assumptions can have. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that made the room feel heavier with each word. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then, one of the staff members raised a hand, asking how they could do better, how they could help create a more inclusive and welcoming environment. It was a question that sparked a discussion, one that felt genuine and hopeful. Even Paul, though he didn't speak, seemed to be listening intently, his posture less defensive than before. After the session, Karen approached Elijah with a smile. "You were incredible," she said. "That was exactly what we needed." Elijah nodded, though he felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. "I'm glad it made an impact," he said, "but this is just the start." As the staff filtered out of the room, Paul lingered near the back. Elijah noticed him hesitating, as if deciding whether to approach. Finally, Paul walked up, his expression hard to read. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," Paul said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I made assumptions I shouldn't have. It wasn't right." Elijah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "It's not just about me," he said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Paul nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I understand. I'll do better." Elijah didn't say anything more, but as Paul turned and walked away, he felt a small sense of closure. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step. In the weeks that followed, the Inclusivity Initiative gained momentum. Karen organized more training sessions, and Elijah found himself becoming a reluctant but effective advocate for change. He spoke at other events, sharing his experiences and pushing for broader conversations about diversity and representation in aviation. But the work wasn't without challenges. There were moments of resistance, people who dismissed the need for change or questioned the relevance of the initiative. Elijah faced those moments with the same calm determination he'd brought to the cockpit, knowing that turbulence was part of the journey. And through it all, he kept his focus on the bigger picture, a future where no one had to prove their worth before being allowed to belong. As Elijah prepared for another flight one crisp morning, he looked out at the hangar he now called his own. The sky above was clear, the kind of perfect blue that reminded him why he loved flying. But the world below still held its complexities, its challenges. Elijah knew there was more work to be done, more barriers to break, and more minds to change. And as he climbed into the cockpit, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey wasn't over, not for him, not for anyone, but he was ready to keep moving forward, one flight at a time. As Elijah settled into the cockpit, readying himself for the day's flight, his mind drifted to the progress being made at the airport. The Inclusivity Initiative had gained traction, and conversations were happening in spaces that had once been silent on the subject. For the first time in a long while, Elijah felt like he was steering change, not just for himself, but for others who would follow. He was just about to radio the tower for clearance when his phone buzzed on the console beside him. It was Karen. Her name appearing on the screen sent a faint ripple of concern through him. She rarely called during flight preparations, and when she did, it was usually about something urgent. He hesitated for a moment before picking up, his voice steady but cautious. "Karen, what's up?" he asked. "Elijah," she began, her tone sharp and uncharacteristically tense. "We've got a situation. I thought you should know before you hear it from anyone else." His grit on the phone tightened. "What kind of situation?" Karen sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. "Someone filed a formal complaint about you. It's anonymous, but they're claiming you've been using the incident with Paul to push a personal agenda. They're saying it's causing division among staff." Elijah felt the air in the cockpit grow heavier. "What? That's ridiculous. Everything I've done has been to address a real issue, not to create division." "I know," Karen said quickly, "and most people here know that too. But whoever filed this seems determined to make it an issue. They sent emails to the board, and now there's talk of an internal review." Elijah leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. The thought that someone might be trying to undermine him wasn't entirely surprising, but it still stung. He'd been careful to approach everything with professionalism and respect, even when he had every right to be angry. But clearly, not everyone saw it that way, or maybe they just didn't want to. "Do you have any idea who's behind it?" he asked. Karen hesitated. "No, but, Elijah, I have to be honest. This could complicate things. If the review goes forward, it might slow down everything we're trying to accomplish." Elijah exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "Let them review. I have nothing to hide." Karen's voice softened. "I believe in you, Elijah, and I'll do everything I can to make sure the truth comes out. But you should be prepared for pushback, for scrutiny. Not everyone wants to see change, even when it's necessary." After hanging up, Elijah stared out at the tarmac, the buzz of airport activity feeling distant. The complaint felt like a calculated move, an attempt to derail not just him, but the momentum they'd been building. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about one person's grudge. It was bigger than that, a backlash against the idea of change itself. Later that day, Elijah decided to confront the situation head-on. He called a meeting with Karen and a few other key figures from the airport staff, determined to get to the bottom of it. The conference room felt charged when he walked in, the air thick with unspoken tension. Karen was there, along with 2 members of the board and a representative from HR. Paul, to Elijah's surprise, was also present, sitting quietly in a corner. Karen opened the meeting by outlining the complaint and explaining the steps being taken to address it. As she spoke, Elijah studied the faces in the room, looking for any hint of who might be behind the anonymous accusations. Most of the staff seemed genuinely concerned, but there was one person, a senior supervisor named Greg, who avoided Elijah's gaze entirely. His body language was stiff, his expression unreadable, but something about his demeanor set off a quiet alarm in Elijah's mind. When Karen finished, Elijah took a deep breath and stood. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Everything I've done since the incident has been with the goal of improving this workplace for everyone. If someone feels differently, I prefer they speak to me directly instead of hiding behind anonymous complaints." The room was silent. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. Paul, for the first time, looked up and met Elijah's gaze. There was something almost apologetic in his expression, though he remained silent. As the meeting ended, Karen caught up with Elijah in the hallway. You handled that well, she said, but I think we need to be careful. If this escalates, it could get messy. Elijah nodded. I'm not afraid of messy. What I'm afraid of is letting this discourage people from speaking up or pushing for change. Karen smiled faintly. I wouldn't expect anything less from you. But even as Elijah tried to push forward, the tension only grew. The anonymous complaint seemed to embolden others, and whispers of dissent began to spread among the staff. Some questioned whether the inclusivity initiative was necessary, while others outright accused Elijah of making a spectacle out of a simple misunderstanding. It all came to a head one evening when Elijah was approached by Paul in the hangar. Paul looked nervous but determined, his hands shoved into his pockets as he walked up to Elijah. I need to talk to you, Paul said, his voice low. Elijah set down the wrench he'd been using and turned to face him. What's on your mind? Paul hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure they were alone. I think I know who filed the complaint, he said finally. And I think I might have made it worse. Elijah frowned, his curiosity piqued, but his frustration simmering beneath the surface. What do you mean? Paul exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. After everything that happened, I talked to Greg. I was venting, saying I felt like you were making a big deal out of something that was over. But I didn't think he'd take it this far. I didn't realize he had his own agenda. The revelation hit Elijah like a jolt. He'd suspected Greg, but hearing it confirmed added a new layer of complexity to the situation. Paul's admission also raised more questions. Why would Greg target him so deliberately? And how far was he willing to go? Before Elijah could respond, Paul added, I'm sorry, man. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't see it for what it was until now. Elijah nodded slowly, his mind racing. Thanks for telling me. But if we're going to fix this, I need you to be honest with Karen about what you just told me. Paul hesitated, but after a moment he nodded. I'll do it. It's the least I can do. As Paul walked away, Elijah felt the weight of the conflict growing heavier. The stakes were higher now, the opposition more calculated. But if there was one thing Elijah knew how to do, it was navigate through turbulence. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about standing firm in the face of resistance and proving that progress couldn't be stopped by fear or ignorance. The tension in the airport reached a boiling point the following week. Paul kept his promise and went to Karen, sharing what he knew about Greg's involvement. Karen, in turn, escalated the matter to the airport board, presenting not just Paul's statement, but also a growing list of evidence that pointed to Greg as the source of the anonymous complaint. It became clear that Greg had been sowing discord, using Elijah's initiative as a scapegoat for his own frustrations with changes at the airport. Elijah, however, was still caught in the storm. While Karen worked behind the scenes to address the situation, whispers among the staff grew louder. Every time Elijah walked through the airport, he could feel eyes on him, hear snippets of conversations that stopped abruptly when he passed by. It wasn't the first time he'd been under scrutiny, but this felt different, like he was on trial not just for his actions, but for daring to challenge the status quo. One afternoon, Karen called Elijah into her office, her expression unreadable. The board is meeting tomorrow to decide how to proceed, she said, but there's something you need to see before then. She handed him a folder filled with documents. Inside were emails Greg had sent to other staff members, explicitly trying to rally opposition against Elijah and the Inclusivity Initiative. The language was sharp and accusatory, painting Elijah as a divisive figure who was disrupting the airport's harmony. But what struck Elijah the most wasn't just the content of the emails. It was the final page in the folder, a formal proposal Greg had submitted to the board. He's pushing for a total shutdown of the initiative, Karen said, her voice tight with frustration. And he's suggesting they reconsider your contract as a tenant. Elijah felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. This wasn't just about the initiative anymore, it was personal. Greg wasn't content to challenge the program, he wanted Elijah gone. The next day, Elijah walked into the boardroom with Karen by his side. The room was filled with familiar faces, board members, senior staff, and even a few representatives from the airport's legal team. Greg was there too, sitting confidently at the far end of the table. His expression was calm, but Elijah could see the faint trace of smugness in his eyes. Karen opened the meeting with a summary of the situation, outlining the complaint, Paul's statement, and the evidence against Greg. As she spoke, Greg's composure began to crack. He shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, as she laid out his actions in painstaking detail. When it was Elijah's turn to speak, he stood and took a moment to gather his thoughts. "This isn't about me," he began, his voice steady but firm. "It's about what kind of environment we want to create here. Aviation is an industry built on precision, trust, and collaboration. If we can't extend those values to the way we treat each other, then we're failing, not just as professionals, but as people." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I didn't ask for any of this. But if standing up for what's right makes me a target, then so be it. I'm not going anywhere. And I hope that after today, neither is the initiative we've worked so hard to build." The room was silent as Elijah sat down. Karen gave him a small nod, her expression one of quiet pride. The board deliberated for what felt like hours, though it was likely only a fraction of that time. When they finally returned with their decision, the tension in the room was palpable. "We've reviewed all the evidence," the chairperson said, her voice measured. "And it's clear that the complaint against Mr. Elijah was unfounded and motivated by personal bias. Furthermore, we've decided to terminate Mr. Gregg's contract, effective immediately, for actions that are not in line with the values of this airport." There was a collective exhale from the room, a release of the tension that had been building for weeks. Greg stood, his face a mix of anger and disbelief. "You're making a mistake," he snapped. But the board's decision was final, and security escorted him out of the room moments later. As the dust settled, Karen turned to Elijah with a smile. "You did it," she said. "We did it." Elijah nodded, though his mind was already racing with what came next. The initiative had survived, but the fight had left its mark on him. He knew there would be more battles ahead. More people like Greg who resisted change, more moments where he'd have to stand his ground. But as he walked out of the boardroom, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Later that evening, as Elijah stood in his hangar watching the sunset, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Paul approaching, holding a small envelope. "I wanted to give you this," Paul said, handing it over. Inside was a handwritten note, an apology, but also a pledge to support the inclusivity initiative moving forward. "I can't undo what happened," Paul said, his voice earnest. "But I want to be part of the solution." Elijah smiled, the tension in his chest easing just a little. "That means a lot," he said. "It's a good start." As the sky turned shades of orange and purple, Elijah climbed into the cockpit of his plane. The open sky stretched out before him, vast and full of possibility. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of clarity. The journey wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. As Elijah took off into the golden sky, the weight of the last few weeks began to lift. The roar of the engine beneath him and the expanse of open air above gave him the clarity he often sought when life on the ground felt too heavy. Up here, there was no room for doubt or distraction, just the focus on the journey and the freedom that came with it. It was a reminder of why he had chosen this path and why he had fought so hard to keep it open for others. When he landed, the reality of everything still lingered, but it no longer felt insurmountable. He spent the next few days quietly tying up loose ends, working with Karen to ensure the inclusivity initiative was back on track. With Greg gone, the air at the airport felt lighter, though Elijah knew the real work was just beginning. Change wasn't something that happened overnight, and there would always be those resistant to it. But for now, he was grateful for the progress they had made and the support they had rallied. Paul, true to his word, became one of the initiative's most vocal supporters. He attended every training session, often sharing his own story of learning and growth. His willingness to own up to his mistakes and work toward a better understanding inspired others, including those who had been skeptical at first. It wasn't easy for Paul, but Elijah could see the effort he was putting in, and that was what mattered most. Karen, ever the optimist, continued to expand the program, reaching out to other airports to share their story and encourage similar initiatives across the industry. Elijah occasionally joined her at speaking events, though he preferred to let her take the lead. He wasn't one for the spotlight, but he knew the power of their story and how it could inspire others. Together, they became a team, united not just by the incident that had brought them together, but by a shared vision for the future. One afternoon, as Elijah was preparing for a flight, he received a visit from a young man who looked to be in his early 20s. He was dressed in a crisp pilot's uniform, his eyes wide with excitement and a hint of nervousness. "Captain Elijah," the young man asked, his voice tinged with awe. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I just wanted to say thank you. Your story, it's the reason I didn't give up on my dream." Elijah paused, surprised but deeply moved. "What's your name?" he asked. "Marcus," the young man replied. "I just got my first job as a co-pilot. I've been following your journey for years. Hearing about what you've overcome, it gave me the courage to keep going, even when it felt impossible." Elijah smiled, shaking Marcus's hand firmly. "Congratulations, Marcus. That's no small feat. You earned this." Marcus nodded, his excitement bubbling over. "I hope I can do what you've done someday, make a difference, inspire others." "You already are," Elijah said. "Just by being here, you're paving the way for someone else. Never forget that." As Marcus walked away, Elijah felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Moments like this reminded him why the fight was worth it. The ripples of his journey were reaching farther than he'd ever imagined, touching lives in ways he couldn't always see but deeply appreciated. Back at the airport, the staff continued to adapt to the changes the Inclusivity Initiative brought. There were still challenges, of course, resistance from a few, bumps in the implementation process, but the overall atmosphere was one of progress and hope. Elijah often found himself reflecting on how far they'd come, grateful for the resilience and determination of those around him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah stood on the balcony of his office, looking out at the bustling airport. The hum of engines and the chatter of passengers created a symphony of movement and possibility. Karen joined him, leaning on the railing with a satisfied smile. "We did good, Elijah," she said, her voice quiet but confident. "We did," he agreed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But there's still more to do." "There always is," Karen said with a chuckle. "But for tonight, let's just take a moment to appreciate what we've accomplished." Elijah nodded, letting the moment wash over him. The journey had been long and fraught with obstacles, but it had also been filled with triumphs, both big and small. He thought about the people who had stood by him, the lessons he'd learned, and the lives he'd touched along the way. It wasn't just his story anymore. It was a collective effort, a shared vision for a better future. As the stars began to twinkle in the evening sky, Elijah felt a profound sense of peace. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but he knew he was ready for them. Because no matter how turbulent the skies might become, he would always find a way to rise above. The airport thrived in the months and years that followed, becoming a beacon for inclusivity and progress in the aviation industry. Pilots like Marcus became the norm rather than the exception, and stories like Elijah's served as reminders of what was possible when people refused to let barriers hold them back. For Elijah, the journey was never just about flying. It was about creating a world where everyone had the chance to soar, and as he looked up at the night sky, filled with endless possibilities, he knew that the future was brighter than ever.